Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here. Sleeper resources that you may not know about. There are a lot of resources in Logos Bible software, but if you've picked up a lot of your resources in base packages or maybe collections, you may not have had time to dig in depth into all of those resources. And so sometimes you have what I call sleeper resources, resources that are really good that you don't even know that you own. Or perhaps you've heard about a resource and you're not sure if it's right for you. Well, that's what I want to do in this series. I want to pick out certain resources that you may not know very much about, and I want to highlight them and tell you why you might want to look into them. Today's resource is David Dorsey's The Literary Structure of the Old Testament. This is a sleeper resource, probably because it doesn't get many hits when it comes to your passage guide or things like that. But this is a fantastic resource that if you don't know about, you ought to. So here I have David Dorsey's The Literary Structure of the Old Testament, okay? And you can see there's a lot of detail here, but what David Dorsey essentially did is he recognized that he needed to go through certain books of the Bible and actually outline where all of the key literary structures were. He started doing this with certain books, and a colleague pressed him to go ahead and do the entirety of the Old Testament. He went ahead and did it. He said he got a lot of breadth there, but maybe a lot of depth. But I think that's okay because I love the fact that he tries to treat all of the major books of the Old Testament and give us some good literary structures. Now, what is a literary structure? Well, these are the sorts of things that actually break down the verse in an outline form, okay? So what you're getting in this resource are really good outlines, really in depth, and it gives you some information about why you might want to break things down in that manner. It's very, very helpful. Let me give you 3 good reasons why you might want to utilize this resource. The first reason you might want to utilize this resource is something that Dorsey calls literary artistry. The fact of the matter is that the Bible is way more complex in its structuring than we ever could have imagined. A lot of liberals like to say that the Bible is just haphazard. It's thrown together in really not a very good fashion, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And you can really appreciate the literary artistry of the Bible if you actually dig into the literary structures. This bolsters your confidence in Scripture. And if you point out these structures and units for the people you are teaching and preaching to, they're going to love the fact that their Bible is so in-depth and beautiful. Secondly, identification of unit boundaries. This helps a ton for your own teaching ministry because you may not know how you want to treat the individual passage. What is your pericope that you want to select? Man, you could select 20 verses, you could select 5. What are you going to pick? Well, if you understand the literary structure of that particular section of Scripture, that's going to aid a lot in deciding what you want to focus on. Finally, guys, I love that he points out that understanding literary structure actually helps discovering the unit's main point, okay? Oftentimes, if you're digging into a passage and you don't know the literary structure, you're going to be focusing on whatever jumps out at you, but that may not be the author's intention. The author may actually have a certain subject that he's trying to highlight, and he will front that with his literary structure. But if you're not aware of the structure, you might miss the point entirely. So these are some good reasons that you might actually want to utilize this resource. Let me just give you a few examples now from the book so that you can get a sense of the resource and feel if it's right for you. First, I love his treatment here of Genesis chapter 1, okay? Here in Genesis chapter 1, he breaks down each of the days of creation, okay? This is commonly referred to in the framework theory, but you can see right away that in days 1, 2, and 3, you have light, sea and sky, and dry land created. And then you have a structure that complements it. In days 4, 5, and 6, you have luminaries, fish and birds, land, animals, and humans. And so you recognize that day 7 is the culmination of the passage, just from a literary standpoint. He says this, in both the linear and parallel structures, the Sabbath day stands in the position of emphasis. That's already helpful. You know what to focus on in this passage. Or let's go ahead and look at Genesis 2 and 3 and the fall of man. You may not have noticed this ahead of time, but this is actually structured as a chiasm. And in a chiasm, the center of the structure is actually the most important point. So if you start in Genesis 2:4, you see that we have the creation of man, you move inward to the creation of the woman, and finally the serpent in conversation with the woman. Then we have the center, the sin and God's uncovering of it. And finally, we move back outwards. We see that God addresses in his cursing the serpent first, then the woman, finally the man. Notice that the cursing mirror images this focus in those first few verses. This is so helpful, and it tells you that you want to focus right in on verses 6 to 13 in Genesis chapter 3. One more chiasm that's pretty neat to look into is actually the breakdown of the flood narrative, okay? Here you can see the entire flood narrative, Genesis 6:9 through 9:19, and it's treated in a chiasmatic structure, okay? Really, really cool to see how this breaks down, and it helps you to focus in on those specific areas. It's so nice to be able to spot the chiasms because God inspired these to help us to understand the very main point. One final section that I want to show you is Proverbs chapter 7, okay? Here in Proverbs, you actually have a breakdown of Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly, and they're compared and contrasted back and forth. If you weren't aware of this, you might not treat the unit in its primary sense, okay? But because of the fact that we actually have a comparison and a contrast between Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly, you can see the emphasis of the section. Notice I'm just going to read what Dorsey says here. He says, the final 4 units of chapters 1 to 9 are arranged symmetrically, as with the 4 introductory units. So here the author opens and closes with the appeals of folly and places the 2 appeals of wisdom in the center. That helps a ton, and you can see how the structure is yet again aiding you in your interpretation. So that's it, guys. I just wanted to highlight this resource. You might already know about Dorsey. That's fantastic. And you already know what a treasure trove his work is. But if you didn't know about it, you should look into picking this one up. You can get it in many of the Baker collections, okay? And it's just going to help you understand how your passage fits into the larger biblical narrative. And it's going to help you to orient people properly as you engage in your preaching and teaching. Thank you so much for engaging with our channel. And if you're interested in supporting us, you can do so down below. We have a Patreon, and not only that, if you utilize our links to Logos, I'm a Logos affiliate, I get a small commission. I appreciate that very much. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. God bless. Bye.